Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm excited to share with you my passion for inventing, especially as fellow testers. So, as Myra said, I am a master inventor with 22 patents and also an automation engineer at LexisNexis. So, I've just recently started blogging, so be sure to check out my site at angiejones.tech, and you can also find me on Twitter at techgirl1908. So before we begin, let's make sure we're all on the same page and have a common understanding of what a patent is. So it's basically an exclusive right granted by a country to make, use, and sell an invention. So why would you want a patent? Well, for starters, it's cool. It's a nice addition to your resume. It's something that you can tell your kids and grandkids about. It's a great way to make your mark on the future of technology. Also, there's big bucks in patents. So pretty much every software company has an intellectual property portfolio that they use to gain a competitive advantage in the market and also to generate income from licensing. So by contributing to your company's intellectual property, or IP as we call it, you're directly affecting the bottom line. So I don't know about you all, but sometimes, especially as a tester, it can be challenging for me to see the profitability of my day-to-day contributions, but with patents, it's something that I can directly point to. Now, many people come to me seeking advice about obtaining patents on their own, but all of my patents are obtained through my company, and there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is that I'm required to by law, and you probably are as well. So most software companies have their employees sign an intellectual property agreement when beginning employment with them. And there's a lot of legal jargon in there, but it basically sums up to the company owning your ideas during your employment. If you really want to pursue the idea on your own, then you'll need to present the idea to your company and allow them the right to refuse it, and also request that they allow you to seek protection for it on your own. Now, if it's in their business area, then they may not allow this, even if they don't want to patent it themselves. I've only known of one person who did this, and he wanted to patent something that wasn't technology related at all, so they did allow for that. Now, as for me, even if I weren't legally required to go through my company, I probably still would do so because applying for a patent can be quite costly. So the price varies by country, but there's usually a complicated schedule of fees where the price increases based on things like company size and the number of claims you have. And then you'll also want your patent application drafted by a professional, so a patent agent or a patent attorney, and that can cost quite a bit as well. And then there's fees associated with the whole process of going back and forth with the patent office. So things start adding up pretty quickly. My patent applications are typically about $25,000 to file, and that's just to have them considered. So there's no guarantee that they'll even be granted. So yes, I let my employer foot this bill, and in return, they then own those exclusive rights that we talked about a couple of slides ago. But I'm listed on the patent as the inventor of the idea, and just about every software company will reward you financially as well. So there's usually a financial incentive to submit the idea, then another monetary award if the company decides to file the patent application, and then yet another monetary award if the patent is issued. And then there's even more money if the patent is involved in licensing. So it's definitely beneficial for the inventor as well. I like to think of it as a side gig to make supplemental income. Now for the fun stuff, how to generate ideas. So I use two approaches, and they're both very effective. One is the passive method, which is problem driven, and then the active method, which is more technology driven. So with the passive method, as testers, we're trained to find anomalies. So the passive approach is just like that, except you're not explicitly seeking out problems. Instead, you need to keep your tester hat on 24/7 so that you're conscious of problems in everyday life as they arise. So pretty much anytime you're annoyed by something, anytime something doesn't do what you'd like it to do, or anytime you think something could work better, then your internal sensor should go off, alerting you that this is an opportunity to invent. Okay, so as you run into these problems, the next step is to start wishing. So ask yourself, what is it that you want to happen? Once you identify the problem, let's call this point A, and you identify your wish, we'll call this point Z. Then you need to start filling in all of the details on how you could possibly get from A to Z. This is the inventing part. So I'll give you an example of how I came up with one of my patents using this passive approach. So I was testing something and it failed, and I began investigating to try to find the root cause of the failure. So I went to the log files to see if there was maybe an exception that had occurred, and there was. And the log showed a stack trace of the lines of code that represented the path that was taken. So this is great info for a bug. However, I had no idea who to assign this bug to. So my sensor went off. I recognized this as a problem. This became my point A. Now, when I'm at point A, I also evaluate the problem right then and there to determine if I'm just being extra sensitive today, or is this a problem that others would face as well. Well, I think other testers would agree that this is a problem, and I also bet that customer support teams really would think that this is a problem because they're getting issues from customers in the field. They need to triage them and debug them, and I bet it would be really helpful if they were able to know who was involved in the original coding of this. So once I convince myself that it is a problem worth solving, the next step is to start wishing, right? So what is it that I want here? So the conversation in my head kind of went like, well, I wish I knew who to assign this bug to based on the info that I see here in the log. So this becomes my point Z. And then the final step again is to fill in the points between A and Z to make my wish come true. So I began to invent a solution by asking myself what is needed to get from A to Z. Okay, so thought process kind of worked like, well, in order to know who to assign the bug to, I need to know who worked on this area of code. Okay, how can I get this info? Well, I could see who checked in the code that was identified in the stack trace. All right, how do I do that? Well, I can use the code repository tool. I know that it does a diff at check-in to see which changed with the code, and it also knows who's making the check-in because they need to be logged in. Okay, so there's definitely the possibility for my wish to come true. The next question is, how can I use these pieces together to make something that's new? Here's what I came up with. So at check-in, I can have the code repository tool to tag each of the changes being checked in with the developer's name, such that if I had a stack trace that specified a code path, the tool can generate a list of all the developers who wrote or edited any of the lines of code that's in this path. Bam, that's the invention. So that gets me from point A to point Z. Now, once you have a solution, you can refine the idea to make it even better. So one way to do this is through collaboration. So I absolutely love collaborating with people on ideas because they bring in their own unique pain points to the situation and enable you to broaden the idea a bit. For example, with this idea, I collaborated with another tester. So I told him the problem and I told him the solution that I came up with, and he was then able to expand upon that and say that he would wish for more than just the developer's name, but he'd also want contact info for the developers in case he wanted to talk to them in person. Okay, good thought. So we added claims around the code repository tool, querying a company directory to get the developer's contact information. Well, this raised another problem to be solved. So there's a privacy concern here with having the developer's information in plain text in a log file that could reside on a customer's system. So we added even more claims around just placing a unique identifier for the developer in the stack trace itself, but then having the code repository tool, which would live on our company's server, decrypt that so that we have the raw list of contacts. So that's it. All I had to do was write this up and submit it to the patent attorneys, who then turned it into a patent application. And after it was reviewed by the government, a patent was issued for it. So you don't have to actually make the product or feature. You don't have to create a proof of concept. Just simply designing the idea is enough to protect it. So I got paid for the idea, and so did my collaborator, who was named as a co-inventor. Now, most companies, they'll pay all the co-inventors the same amount of money that they would have gotten if they invented it solo. So there's no reason not to collaborate. There's usually like a cap, maybe 4 people or so, but up to that, then everyone would get the same thing. Okay, so that's the passive problem-driven approach. Now, one thing about this approach is that once you've activated your internal sensor, you'll run into problems or annoyances all the time. So you never knew how irritable you actually were until you turned the sensor on. So you'll start seeing problems with your products, with other technology that you use, in the grocery store, driving, everywhere. And you won't always be in a position to solve these problems, or the steps to get from A to Z might not be apparent to you at that given moment. So what I do is jot these problems down when they arise, and then I come back to solve them at a later date. So a lot of companies have hackathons or innovation days sometimes, and what I see is a lot of testers aren't really sure of what they can do during these days. Now you have a whole list of problems that need innovative solutions, so you can work on that. And you also can schedule brainstorming sessions. So outside of those days, you can schedule brainstorming sessions and bring these problems to a small team of people and try to solve them together. If you do this, I recommend getting a diverse group together so that you have different perspectives. So include women and men, and maybe one person from dev, one person from test, one person from product. Okay. Now, one note about collaborating is, in order for someone to be named as a co-inventor, they have to have contributed to at least one of the claims that you all come up with. So if someone's just sitting in the room, they're not really adding anything to the idea, or maybe they're just commenting saying, oh yeah, that's a great idea, then legally they're not considered an inventor. So if you do these collaboration groups, just make sure you set the rules in advance. Okay, now let's look at the active method. So this active approach is more technology driven. You pick a technology that you want to look into and you attempt to come up with problems. So this is very similar to exploratory testing, where you're out trying lots of different things in an attempt to find gaps or holes. In fact, you can use the active approach while doing your exploratory testing. So instead of looking for bugs, look for omissions or undeveloped areas in your application that you think might be valuable. Also, the active approach is excellent for exploring new ideas and new technologies. So this is a great way to break outside of your day-to-day work and stay up to date on new trends. So I see some of you doing fun activities like weekend testing. So this will be a venture for the group one weekend to go check out a new space and hunt for ideas. You all just be sure to invite me, okay? So let me tell you about one of my patents that I created using the active approach. Second Life is a virtual world where you can exist through an avatar and you interact with other people's avatars in this virtual space. Now, back when this first came out, a buddy and I went in to learn more about it, and we basically went patent hunting. Now, let me tell you, we had a blast playing in this virtual world and have several patents on virtual worlds because of it. Well, while we were in there, there was a real world, there's a lot of real world companies there that have presence in this virtual space. And there was even a popular tech company there who was hosting a conference in the virtual world. The agenda for the day-long conference was visible outside the conference doors, and there was a talk that I wanted to hear, but I missed it. They covered it earlier that day. So my sensor goes off. I immediately recognize this as a problem that needs to be solved. So this is my point A. What do I wish for? I wish I could have seen the talk. So that becomes my point Z. Now you see, the virtual world was mimicked after the real world, so it included these real world limitations such as time. But since we are in a virtual world, we should be able to be more creative with these types of things. So guys, I invented time travel in a virtual world. Cool, right? So the invented steps to jump from A to Z were to have the virtual world record the events and essentially have a user request to replay this event and insert the user's avatar into the event so that they can feel immersed and as if they attended the event in person. Now, I didn't have to actually build a time machine. All I had to do was explain how one might go about developing this in a virtual world. So that's the active technology-driven method. Some cool things that I found with using this approach is that when learning these new technologies, sometimes I find the missing pieces needed to solve one of the older problems that I have on my list. So my old problem in this new technology may be totally unrelated, and that's the beauty of it. No one has come up with this correlation but you. Now allow me to share an example of an age-old problem that I was able to solve after learning about newer technologies. So everyone here will be able to relate to this. I went to the grocery store and was ready to check out. And there were several lanes open, so I looked at each line in an attempt to see which one would be the quickest. Now, after I got online, it became obvious that I had chosen the wrong line because mine seemed to be moving the absolute slowest. So I'm sure this has happened to everyone in more than once. So I knew that this was a problem worth solving. Okay, so I made my wish. And my wish was that I would know which line was the most optimal one. Now, at that moment, I wasn't quite sure of how to get from point A to point Z. So I simply jotted the problem down so that I would remember to revisit it at a later date. Well, a couple of months later, I ran across an article that talked about a personal shopping assistant device that could help customers decide which products to buy by giving them the nutritional information about the products when entered into their cart. Now, in searching through my list of problems, it hit me that I could use such a device as one of the pieces to get me from A to Z with the checkout problem. So I reasoned that if we have technology that can recognize what's going inside of a cart, this same technology can recognize all of the contents inside of the cart and then can more accurately calculate how long it would take a cashier to scan all of these items. I also reasoned that the device could consider what types of items are in the cart because things like produce, which need to be punched in, that takes longer than the items that can simply be scanned. So I then began to expand the solution to include more pieces that would make the the calculation even more efficient. So I went to the store a few more times and paid closer attention to things that would hold up the line, like checking for ID when the person was paying with a credit card or buying alcohol. I also recognized that there were some things that the cart wouldn't be able to know, like when the cashier needs to go get cigarettes for the customer, for example, or when the customer has to write out a check, or customers who use tons of coupons. So all of these things take quite a bit of time and slows down the process as well. So I asked myself, how can I solve each of these problems? Well, in addition to the cart calculation, if we knew who the customer was, we could also use things like their shopping habits to determine if they're going to buy cigarettes or alcohol, if they're going to pay with credit or check, if they're going to pull out a wad of coupons. And we could get this information from their loyalty cards, which stores their shopping history. Another thing that I knew for a fact was that some cashiers were just faster than others. So I was a cashier in high school, and I prided myself on being a star cashier because of my scanning rate. So I knew that I better throw this in as a factor in the calculation as well. So in putting all of these pieces together, I came up with an estimated weight calculator that can be used in any retail store that has checkout lines. So I invented a way to enhance the personal shopping assistant device that I read about to solve my problem that I had on my list. Okay, and the way it goes about doing it is to have the customer scan in their loyalty card, have the device read all of the items that's in the cart, and have the store to place floor sensors at the checkout so that the personal assistant device could send an estimation to the calculator that would be installed at each of the checkout lines. So the calculator would then be able to sum up the estimation from each person who's in line and display a total estimated wait time above its lane based on who is in that line. That way, people can easily see the estimated wait time for each line and make a more informed decision. Okay. Now, I always tell aspiring inventors not to become married to their great ideas, because after you've come up with your solution, you have to put it through a series of tests to determine if it's truly patentable, and it may not be, so you need to be able to let it go and move on with your life if you have to. Now, this list may vary slightly per country. This is the list for the United States, but these are the basic tests. So I'll go through each one of these to explain them. So for the subject matter test, there's certain things that can be patented. They must fall under one of these four categories. So I won't bore you with the details of each of these, but I've added a link for those who'd like to read more about it, and we'll make these slides available for you. But basically, this is trying to protect people from patenting very abstract things like feelings and emotions. Things like that can't be patented. Your idea also must be novel. So this basically means it must be a brand new idea that has never seen the light of day. So a lot of people think that they can patent anything that hasn't already been patented, and this is far from true. So anything at all that has been made public is considered prior art and can exclude your idea from being novel. So this includes patents, publications, products, articles, blogs, things that you've seen in movies, anything. To determine if there's prior art on your idea, you need to do a search. So hopefully your company has Total Patent, which is an awesome patent search engine made by my company, LexisNexis. But if not, then Google will have to do. So you can search the regular way, and then there's also a Google specifically for searching for patents. So it's patents.google.com. Now, I recommend searching for a good 30 minutes. If you don't find your idea by then it's probably not out there, and you've done your due diligence in looking. And don't worry, trust me, this won't be the last search done. So your company's IP team will also do a very thorough search before submitting the application. And they'll hopefully give you the opportunity to differentiate your idea from any prior art that they may have found. Now, one way I see people trip themselves up with this one is by filing patent applications on the cool features that just went into their release that shipped. Now, as soon as your product becomes publicly available, you have inadvertently created prior art against yourself. So if you want to patent something that's actually going in your product, you need to let your company's IP team know as soon as possible before the release date so that they can rush the patent application to the patent office. This next test, the non-obviousness test, this one is one that really isn't very obvious. So the way it works is with a question. You must ask yourself, if the problem that I solved was presented to someone who is skilled in the art, would they have come up with this solution? If the answer is yes, then the solution is obvious and therefore not patentable. Here's where people get tripped up. So this fictitious person who is skilled in the art, this person should be thought of as someone with average knowledge of the space you're inventing in. You're an expert, especially if you're coming up with inventions on the product that you're working on. You're the SME. Everyone comes to you to ask how the product works. So of course the solution may be obvious to you, but you're not the fictitious person who this test is referencing. So even if it's obvious to you, ask yourself, if you only had average knowledge of this product, would it still be obvious? An enabling description is the write-up of how you get from point A to point Z. So you need to give enough detail such that if someone wanted to develop this idea, they could based on your description. So most companies will have a form that you fill out for this step, so that makes it a bit easier. The standard parts of the form are the title, and this should clearly describe what your invention is. So don't get fancy here. It's not meant to woo an audience or anything. It should be very straightforward. For example, the debugging patent that I went over, that one's called Identifying a Software Developer Based on Debugging Information. The virtual world one is called System and Method for Attending a Recorded Event in a Metaverse Application. And the store checkout one is System and Method for Calculating Wait Time for Checkout. So you see, straight to the point. Okay, the next part of the form would be a description of the problem that you're solving. So my advice to you is to write this problem up in a way that doesn't give away what the solution is. So I used to sit on a couple of invention review boards, and I've seen people write the problem up by saying that it needs XYZ as the solution. Well, remember, one of the tests is the non-obviousness. And if you give a human being hints to the answer, then they may easily arrive at the answer and therefore conclude that your idea is obvious. For example, let's take the developer debugging idea that I talked about. So I wrote the problem up basically saying, like, I have a log file in a company full of people. I have no idea who to talk to concerning this log file. So I'd say that, you know, more sophisticated than that, but that's the gist. And that's much different than me stating the problem as I am unable to identify which developer's code is referenced in the log file. Now, both of these statements are true, but the second one kind of gives away what the solution is. And so that would increase the likelihood of my idea being shut down by my IP team. Okay? The next part of the form would be to identify known solutions to this problem. So this is where you list any of the prior art that you may have found during your search. The key here is not only to list the prior art, but to specify the drawbacks to these known solutions that are addressed by your invention. So this will send a message that your invention is the most advantageous and complete solution. Okay, and the last piece of the form is the detailed description of your invention. So this is where you put your architect hat on. So you don't have to give all the nitty-gritty details like specifying the programming languages or anything like that, but you need to be able to clearly walk someone through the instructions so that you prove that this is possible. Pictures also help here, but there's no need to go overboard because your patent attorney will take your write-up, which should be no more than 1 to 2 pages, and the agent will redo it all and turn it into a very thorough legal document. Now, this final test, the bonus test, this one is not required by your patent office, but it's one that your company will look into before they decide if they're going to invest in the patent application. So they need to make sure that the idea is a potential moneymaker for them. So ones that are typically dismissed as low value are ones that are too specific to a certain application. Think about it. If it's a product-specific idea and it's only applicable to your product, then who's going to pay to license it, right? So you need to make sure that your idea is something that competitors will want too, and also make sure that it's solve a problem that more than just you are facing. Okay, so once you have your idea, you've ran it through the patentability test and you've written it up, you can then submit it to your company's IP team. So some of the larger companies, they use their senior technologists and inventors to evaluate the idea before they get the IP team involved. Other smaller companies, they'll just send it right to the IP team. Now, the evaluators will basically run your idea through the patentability test themselves, and they'll ensure that there aren't any gaping holes in the idea. If they think it's patentable and valuable, then they'll have the attorney draft up a patent application. Again, this document becomes very long and is filled with all sorts of legal jargon. You'll hardly recognize your idea once it gets to this point. The drafting phase can take a couple of months or so, and then they'll have you review it and correct anything before it's submitted to the patent office. The hard part comes once it's submitted. You then have to wait for like a very long time. So here in the US, it takes about 3 to 7 years before the patent is issued. But our patent office is backed up. And my latest patent, which issued this May, had been submitted 9 years ago. So it's looking more like 3 to 9 years these days. The good thing is that once your idea is submitted as a patent application, is made publicly available to view. So it prevents others from attempting to invent this same thing, and also lets your competitors know that you have a pending patent on the way for this idea. Now, throughout this time, there may be some back and forth between the patent office and your company. So sometimes the patent office will attempt to reject or strike some of the claims, and your IP team will attempt to defend them. Very rarely would an inventor be brought into these conversations. Typically, the IT team has a good handle on it by this point. And then after the review, if the patent office determines that this is a new idea that meets the standards of a patent, then one will be granted to your company, and at this point, you're a new patent inventor. So that's the guide to patent development in a nutshell. The key, again, is to use your testing skills to be aware of the problems around you, make a wish, and then figure out how to grant it yourself. Are there any questions?
All right. Now it's a good time to write your questions in the tool that we have on the webinar platform. And we can already get started with the questions. And one of the things that has been asked is if you would have any examples of ideas, in particular in software testing, that cannot be patented.
Hmm. No, because pretty much any process can be patented. Um, so like an approach or a method or a process that you use in testing can be patented. The thing is to look for the prior art in that space. So has it been done before? Is this something new that you're coming up with? Another thing that goes to the value statement is whether your company would be able to detect if someone else is doing this. So if it's an internal process that you're doing as a tester, and then let's say a competing company started doing that same process, right? How would you know that? If it's not something that you can detect, then you wouldn't be able to pursue that, right? So you wouldn't be able to prevent them from doing it or seek licensing fees or anything like that. So that's the key there.
Uh, there's a question about open source projects. The question is that this Lisa from Lisa Crispin, that she's not sure if her company actually does patents or not, but they do a lot of open source projects. How do you see
Mhm.
patents and open source? Are they incompatible, or what's the relationship there?
So good question, and a lot of people in the open source space kind of frown upon patents as if you're trying to keep others from using it or restrict others from using it. So I think of patents not as a prevention, but as protection. So as we come up with the ideas, when you patent it, you make the idea readily available. You've already written out all of the steps on how to do it. So it's out there, but you're protecting that idea so that someone doesn't just run away with the idea and make tons of money without giving you, the inventor of the idea, your due rewards for that.
And then you mentioned a lot of times this IP team. What if your employer doesn't have an IP team or doesn't actually see much of interest in patenting? How could you have any advice on how do you end up with somebody or a company that is into this patenting thing?
Sure. So if you were working for like a startup or a really small company, they may not have an IP team yet, or they may just have one person. So when starting their business, hopefully they sought legal advice and had someone available to protect or advise them on how to protect their intellectual property. So even though that team may not be visible to you, they probably do exist. Now, if you're at a place that doesn't have one, then maybe you didn't sign an intellectual property agreement either, because that would be one of the things that the attorney would have advised your company to have. So if you're not bound by that agreement, then you could seek to invent on your own, but again, that does cost quite a bit. So you want to be sure that the idea would be something that you could generate revenue from, at least get back what you put in and hopefully more.
Also, some of your examples kind of sounded like they're for different problem domains than what you usually work with, that you're kind of combining things in a very, let's say, ingenious way, even. Is your employer still usually into them, even if they are from completely different domains than what your company usually works on?
So it depends on the company. Some of the bigger companies, this is a strategy of theirs. Their intellectual property portfolio and working that portfolio. So a lot comes into what's in this portfolio. So one is generating the licensing income. So that's a way that they make money. Two is cross-licensing with other companies. So when you're a really huge company, you may get into a lot of different domains and you may step on a few toes and kind of infringe on other companies' patents. Well, when you have a really vast patent portfolio, then you can start cross-licensing with these other people. Like, yes, I'm sorry, I did infringe on your patent, but hey, look, you're infringing on 10 of our patents, so let's make a deal as opposed to going to court with this, right? Um, did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's Really good one.
Okay.
I was also curious on how did you get started with this whole patenting thing? Like, where did you learn to think this way? Like, it seems very natural now that you speak about it, but how did you come to this?
hmm So I saw a lady down the hall who worked where I was working, and she had a plaque on her wall about a patent that she had. And so I was like, wow, it's really cool that she had a patent. So I asked her if I could talk with her about it. And she was like, sure. But instead of talking with me, she invited me to a brainstorming session. So one of those collaborative sessions that I talked about with other people. And so at first, I really didn't have much to contribute. So I didn't go on as an inventor, but I was in the room and I kind of just saw the way that they thought through the problems and how they used existing technologies but combined them in creative ways to make something new. And once I started thinking like this, then it became much more natural. That sensor that I talk about, it was one of those things that just kind of comes on once you once you intentionally want it there. So you cut this thing on and you just start recognizing problems all the time. And one way to solve these problems again is by dabbling in other technologies. So not just what you work on day to day, but just reading technical articles, being aware of new technologies that come out, going and playing around with the different technologies. So this just gives you a much broader perspective, and you start seeing ways that you can utilize this technology to solve problems that may exist in your domain.
I've noticed that your work nowadays, at least, is mostly on the test automation side. Do you have any patents
hmm
in that area?
I don't, Marit.
Hmm. So it's still like a thing that where you're kind of like inventing more and getting more into stuff. You already
Yeah.
mentioned your blog that you have one. Could you share the address of that and give people a bit of advice on how to reach you for later questions if they have any?
Sure. So, um, my blog is angiejones.tech, Tech, and I'm also on Twitter at techgirl1908. So if anyone has any questions, if you think of something later, you can definitely reach out to me, and I would be more than happy to help you.